Welcome to this video about the revision of the second demand. So we know there is a global climate and ecological crisis, and we want the government to act now. Here is the first half of the Dutch demands. I will discuss the second half later, but for now it is important to know that in the Netherlands we are demanding that as of now the government must enact legally binding policies to year-on-year reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the Netherlands to net zero by 2025. It must remove the excess of atmospheric greenhouse gases by regenerating ecosystems. So what we are demanding here is that we reach net zero by 2025 and that this is done by regenerating ecosystems. Now, it is important to note that net zero is not the same as zero emissions. We recognize that there will be some emissions that cannot be avoided, for example, from farming and flying, and these emissions must be compensated for somehow. Now, in generally, there are two ways in which this compensation can be done, more or less, if you look at the kind of larger perspective. And these two are natural carbon sinks, such as trees, and then there's geoengineering, which basically in this context means storing CO2 underground, for example, in empty gas reservoirs, stuff like that. But there's issues with most compensation measures, because if we want to cut the atmospheric carbon pool by about 25%, we would need to plant about 5 billion trees. And this would need to be a massive global effort, and trees need some time to grow. So there's questions if just using natural carbon sinks, if that will be enough. Now, if you want to supplement that with geoengineering technology, such as carbon capture, this might sound promising, but all of these techniques are in the early stages of development, and generally they involve some dangers and some ethical and practical difficulties. So that also is not optimal. Therefore, reducing emissions to a minimum remains of paramount importance, because no single solution offers an easy fix. And the French demands here are a nice example of a way to emphasize the reduction of consumption and energy use. Well, you can read that for yourselves. Now, it is important to be aware of the criticism that our demands were too detailed, and that the decision on specific measures, such as natural carbon sinks versus geoengineering, should be up to the citizens' chamber. And furthermore, other groups have proposed numerous measures, and we won't be adding much by proposing specific ones, meaning the demand should probably focus on the what rather than the how. So that is a net zero or carbon neutrality. And now I'll briefly discuss why we're demanding that it happens in 2025. The Dutch government is currently aiming for a 49% reduction of emissions in 2030 compared to 1990, and a 95% reduction by 2050. We think that is too slow. If you look at the website of the climate agreement of the current government, it actually has a quite relaxed vibe. It literally says we have 31 years, so we don't need to do everything right now. But if you're really looking at the data, we do need to act right now, and even the International Panel on Climate Change is saying as much. Now, let me elaborate this figure a little bit. So what you see here is the historic temperature change. So this is the track we're on now, and this is where we're going. And then this is time. This is the future, and this is the amount that global temperatures will rise. Now, there's three specific scenarios that are presented here. So if we manage as a planet to reach net zero in 2055, and we also manage to reduce the non-CO2 greenhouse gases after 2030. So if we manage to do all of that, then we will be in the gray scenario, which means that the likelihood of being above 1.5 degrees is actually quite large. You can see that it's all that area here, and that is actually 25% of the range in 2100, but it already starts basically at 2030. We might already be above 1.5. So that's where we're heading, and I think that's a rather large chunk. Now, if we do not manage to reduce our non-CO2 greenhouse gases at all, then we are probably not gonna be able to stay under 1.5, as you see in the purple scenario here, that most of it is actually above 1.5, and again, that starts already rather early. Now, the somewhat more optimistic scenario, so when the CO2 net zero is reached in 2040, and we are again reducing the other greenhouse gases, then we will see that in 2100 we're most likely again under 1.5 degrees, but we're gonna maybe dip over it anyway. So I would say that even the optimistic scenario is still not cutting it, because what is important to realize is that the IPCC is conservative by nature, and its predictions have been known to underestimate the severity of global heating. Furthermore, it generally doesn't tend to take tipping points into account, such as the melting of the ice caps or the loss of the Amazon, which will increase the chances of runaway global heating. So if we are on this nice track here, and even if we do manage to reach carbon neutrality by 2040, so we're in the nice little optimistic blue scenario, we might still be fucked, because if we reach 1.6 here, and that means the ice caps will not stop melting, then we will have runaway global warming anyway. So that is not taken into account in most of these models. Right. So that is basically why we have to stay under 1.5 as much as possible. We are now at 1.1 degree global heating, and we are already seeing the devastating effects that are starting to emerge. The 20 hottest years on record were in the last 22 years, and so we really need to act now. And that's what this demand is all about. It's also important to remember that with this demand, we're trying to shift the Overton window. The Overton window is the range of ideas that are tolerated in public discussions, so ideas that are not considered to be too extreme. If we demand net zero by 2025, that makes Urhanda and other organizations, such as Klimaatneutraal 2030, suddenly look much more reasonable. So maybe collectively we can make these ideas more palatable for politicians and the general public. So that is that about net neutrality, but that is not the only thing we're talking about in this demand. It's not the only thing you should consider. We do not want to focus, for example, on the climate crisis only, because there's more going on than just that. For example, if you look at the Belgian demands, it asks the government to prioritize restoration of biodiversity and the preservation of our natural environment. And this is a good example of how you could include the ecological crisis too. But you could also think about like plastic pollution and other issues that basically are threatening nature and the world at large. Then, furthermore, there should also be an element, or there could be an element related to fairness and/or justice in our demand. This is especially important if you end up deciding to drop the fourth demand. One good example of this would be the Swift demand, which includes maximum protection for all people and species, especially the most vulnerable. Then yet another element is that currently, so this is the second part of the demands as they are in place right now. And this very specifically speaks about international agreements and general policies. Now, the rationale behind this is that we could point to specific policies and demand that they be reversed, such as the agreement about the growth of Schiphol, because people were very worried about those specific policies when these demands were written. Now, the last specific part of the demands is about international agreements and international cooperation. This part is also included in the Canadian and Australian demands, which speak of enacting legally binding policies and international cooperation, which is going to be extremely important, of course, because it is going to take a global effort to curb the effects of the climate and ecological crisis. So now to summarize, carbon neutrality is not the same as zero emissions. We still will have to compensate somehow for the emissions we cannot avoid making, but we should probably focus on emitting as little CO2 as possible. We're demanding net zero by 2025 because the ship is really sinking now, and because we're trying to shift the Overton window. We're not going to go into specifics, probably that would be the best, because that is the Citizens Chamber job, and there are many other organizations with good ideas. And then finally, besides net zero, you might want to consider these other elements, such as the ecological crisis and biodiversity loss, how to incorporate fairness and justice, what to do with the part about laws and agreements, and if you want to incorporate international cooperation or not. So that was the presentation on the review of the second demand, and I wish you all good luck. Bye.